Okay, I had planned to talk to you a little bit about Paraguay. There's Paraguay. That's all you're going to see of it because I'm moving on. So we're going on to Brazil. There's just so much I want to tell you, and I could talk about Brazil that I just don't have the time. And as you'll see today, I have a whole lot of pictures, so we'll go through many of them pretty quickly. But Brazil is near and dear to my heart. I'll give you, first of all, a personal tour. That's myself and my brother Jim, who some of you may know, arriving in the port of Rio de Janeiro when I was 6 or 7 years old. And we moved to Brazil. Daddy and Mama were missionaries for the Methodist Church, and so I actually grew up in Brazil. Came back over to the States to go to college. And so my whole upbringing experience was in Brazil. And I'll show you where we lived, down in the southeastern part of the country, which is a more heavily populated area. Of course, we landed in Rio. I had an aunt who ran a school in Rio, so we frequently went back over there. Lived for 5 years in Sorocaba, which is about 50 miles from the big city of São Paulo, and then spent another 5 or 7 years out in Rio Preto, São José do Rio Preto, which at that time was a fairly frontier-like settlement, cattle raising and people packing guns and things like that. Very different today, though. And then I have a brother who currently resides in Piracicaba. Auburn University has had extensive connections with the agronomy school in Piracicaba, and so we interacted a lot with that. If I go back to Brazil, that's usually where I'll go, is to be with them. Here I am in first grade, and I still remember that day. They thought it was odd. I'm left-handed, and they insisted on putting the pen in my right hand, and I couldn't understand that, to take the picture. This is the street where we first lived in Sorocaba, looking out the window. Mama took this picture. I love sitting out here and looking out the window. Trains would go by, boats on the river, all kinds of activity on the street. Years later, a few years later, this is what the house looked like, and different color and everything. That's the window from which that previous picture was taken. You can go to a website and put in an address, and it will take you to a picture, a photograph of that house somewhere in the world, anywhere in the world. Here's the website, showmystreet.com. So I went there just a few days ago before teaching this class. Notice the building on the left here, blue and stone. Well, that's what happened. The house is gone. Very sad to say. That one's still there. So anyway, I'm glad I have that other picture. This is what the street looks like now. These are kids I played with, neighborhood. Now we moved to another part of town, but you can see it's quite poor. Daddy built a big church in this neighborhood, and so those are the folks I would hang out with. Here I am in some sort of general assembly in elementary school, down there in the mass of boys looking up at the principal. This is later on in Rio Preto. This is out on the steps, front steps of one of the services, and I'm staring off into I don't know what. Here is one of my high school pictures, and I'm in the back there, still in touch with her on Facebook. Headed off to the States here, all dressed up, saying goodbye to my mother. Ready to go off to college at 17. Came to Auburn University. This is after military service in Vietnam, academic degrees in Florida, and have been here, of course, employed as professor of geography, and then we had an Institute for Latin American Studies. Many of you may remember Mason Marville, who was director of international programs, and so he and I traveled frequently. Here we are back in Piracicaba. This is agronomy school in that city. Kept in touch with people. This is in the market down there, talking to folks. My two brothers, both academics. Jim is professor of religion at Emory and Henry College. Johnny is chair of the anthropology department at the University of Sao Paulo, and so we've collaborated on some things and having a good meal there. Some of you may know, one of the research interests that I've been involved in was the movement of the Confederados to Brazil. These are people who left the South immediately after the Civil War and established settlements in Brazil. And several thousand of them went down, and many of them ended up in an area around near where we were in a town that became known as Americana. So that's been a research interest of mine, written books about. Nancy Daniel came from Alabama, died fairly young, and she's buried in a little cemetery, a place called Campo there in the interior of the state of Sao Paulo. The Americans who settled there were not allowed to use public cemeteries. The cemeteries were controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. These were Protestant, and so at that time they were viewed as heathen. So they had to have their own cemetery, and so somebody provided a hectare of land, and so even up to the present, if you're a direct descendant of these Americans, then you have the right to be buried there. It's an interesting situation. And of course, motivated by the conflict over here, a lot of uncertainty after the Civil War. The folks in the South didn't know what to expect, not too happy with the outcome, and so many of them packed up and sought residence in other parts of the world, and majority of them ended up in Brazil. This fella, William Norris, was from Alabama. He was a state senator from the area around Selma. Called him colonel, but he wasn't a real colonel. That's what folks did back then. Here's a little chapel in that cemetery area. They still have regular services there, meet 4 times a year, reenact elements of the Confederacy. It's an interesting experience. So anyway, that's been a research. We've written books about that, articles.
Did they reestablish slavery down there?
No, they didn't. That was one of the things people have the idea that, well, they were attracted by slavery. Slavery persisted in Brazil until 1888. But these were not the wealthy plantation owners. They didn't have a lot of money. They were just small-scale farmers, some doctors, teachers, people of that sort. And at that time, by that time, there were laws that prevented importing slaves into Brazil, so they couldn't bring anybody from the United States. Communication, language was the problem. They were speaking English, everybody else Portuguese, and so a few of them had a few slaves, but by and large, no. I say it was a motivation, though, because it was a stable agricultural-based society, something they were familiar with. And so they felt more at ease, more at home with that situation than what they thought was happening here in the South. Okay, let's talk about Brazil, the nation. It's a big nation. The area is about half of the territory of South America. And that size relationship represents the population as well. About half of the people in South America live in Brazil. So it's a big country, and it's a lot of people there. Just to recap a little bit of the history that we were talking about earlier, remember this area was divided up among the aristocrats from Portugal, and they had these captaincies. Not much going on here in this area. Meanwhile, in Spanish America, a lot of activity, mining, and more interest and involvement by the Spanish government. They did start growing sugarcane up along the northeast coast of Brazil. And for that purpose, then you find large numbers of people brought over as slaves from Africa. And I showed you this map earlier showing the width of the arrow indicating the size of the population that was being moved across the Atlantic Ocean. Talked about the bandeiras and the bandeirantes, explorers that began moving into the interior in the southeast, setting off primarily from Sao Paulo. And you find the focus in shifting to the south. Rio becomes an important city. One of the big events, I didn't mention this, one of the big events that happened at the turn of the century in Rio de Janeiro was they battled successfully against yellow fever. Yellow fever was a big problem, as it was in many other parts of the world. And they were able then to eradicate the mosquito in many of the swampy areas around this bay. This is Guanabara Bay. And from that point forward, then, the population in Rio really exploded. It became a major center and became the capital of Brazil as a result of John IV moving to Brazil. This was in the early 19th century. Left behind his son. His son declared Brazil independent, Dom Pedro. And so from 1822 all the way up to the present, it's been an independent nation. His son ruled for a long time, from 1831, 1889, stable government. He was an emperor, but an enlightened emperor interested in economic development, generally not oppressive as you might think of some autocrats. Uprisings now and again. One notable one was the revolt of 1924, involved the area where I ultimately lived and areas to the south. Eventually, as a result of some of those disturbances, this fellow comes to power. Getúlio Vargas, notice he ruled during a period little before Juan Perón in Argentina, and sometimes he's compared to Perón. Some sympathies with the fascist governments in Europe during the war, but in general, his government, his rule was not as oppressive as you find among some of the dictatorships in other parts of South America. Was re-elected president, and I forget the exact details, but he committed suicide in 1951. More recently, you've had other more strong-arm governments. One was the revolution in '74 that brought military government to Brazil. This fellow here, Humberto Castelo Branco, former general, he led that. But I put a picture of Pinochet here to remind me to tell you that these military governments, and this lasted into the 1980s, the military governments in Brazil were not as violent and repressive as the ones either in Chile or in Argentina. In Argentina, you had thousands and thousands of disappearances, people being assassinated, killed, similar with Pinochet in Chile. Some of this in Brazil, but not nearly as significant in terms of reducing human rights, human freedom. But eventually, back to freely elected democracies, a series of presidents, one of whom was impeached. And then there's another impeachment I'll mention. Here you see President Obama shaking hands with Lula, who was a leader from the Workers' Party and had, at least in my opinion, a fairly successful presidency in Brazil, although maligned, and he was eventually caught up in some of the corruption scandals that have racked the country. He was replaced by Dilma Rousseff, who she had been arrested during the previous military regime, and you can see, but my brother, who lives down there, says that she's one of the more honest people ever to have been in government, and yet she was impeached, again caught up in some of the corruption scandals, and it's his impression, and you know, I don't agree with him completely. It's his impression, though, that she was simply caught up in a web of intrigue and corruption that involved a lot of people under her, and she was ignorant of what was going on. Here's the current president, and more conservative than the previous ones, and also not really very popular. So they've had a run of leaders that, since Lula at least, have not been very popular. I'll talk more about politics and some of the corruption and the scandals and what Brazil has been going through. Let me just say this. Sometimes I've read comparisons of political situation in Brazil to what's been happening in Venezuela. There are significant differences. Brazil has had its share of economic problems, inflation, and as I mentioned, the corruption. But what's been happening in Brazil for the last several years now is that the judiciary, the judges, the prosecutors have worked systematically to ferret out a lot of these things. And it's been ongoing. You know, it's been a process, and people are going to jail. And what you don't have is efforts by this guy or anybody else to subvert or to undercut that process. It's just being allowed to go forward. The military has not been involved, whereas typically in many countries under these circumstances, you'd find the military, the general stepping in, a coup taking place, and similar kinds of behavior to what you see happening with Moreno in Venezuela, where he's doing everything he can to keep himself in power. But anyway, I see that as, that's not saying that what they're uncovering is positive. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. But nevertheless, it is a silver lining, I think, in this process, that at least it's moving forward and they are behaving in a somewhat civilized manner. But we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. Okay, looking at the overall population distribution in this area, you can see again the outline of the population around the outer areas of South America. In Brazil, people are heavily concentrated along the coast of the northeast and then in the southeast down in this region. Meanwhile, you have a large, fairly empty area out in the middle of the country in the Amazon region. Again, most people in this coastal area. Overall, Brazil is a very large country. It's bigger than the United States if you don't count Alaska and Hawaii. But the overall physical geography is fairly uniform. You don't have the diversity that you do even in the United States. States, we have deserts, we have tropical forests, we have big mountains, we have all kinds of features, which makes for an interesting country. Well, you do have some mountains in Brazil, but they're just barely higher than the Appalachians here in the United States. You have some dry areas in the interior of the Northeast, but not what you would actually consider desert. You have large areas of tropical rainfall. Temperature doesn't vary that much throughout the country until you get to the extreme south. Only way down here in the south would you find occasional snowfall. So you have fairly uniform physical geography, both climate, landscape, not that much of a diversity compared to, let's say, the United States or even a place like Chile. So fairly uniform physical geography. But when you look at things like society, the economy, there is great variation. And I just for the heck of it, I did a little comparison here. Now the data's a little bit old, so don't worry so much about the numbers. But what I wanted to do is compare the richest states in the United States with the poorest states. This is directly from statistics, and you may be pleased to see that Alabama's not down there somewhere. So the average per capita income of the richest states is $34,000. Poorest states, $21,000. And so so the rich are 61% more than the lowest, which is a significant difference. But I want to compare that to Brazil now. Here are the similar comparisons of the richest and the poorest states in Brazil. The richest up here at the top and the poorest down here at the bottom. And you have the similar numbers. And so here you have a difference of 232% difference between this cluster of states. Now there's some regionalization here in the United States, so a significant number of these are here in the South, for instance, of the poor ones. But in Brazil, this economic difference shows up dramatically on a map. So here you're looking at the Southeast. This is the Northeast. So you have very dramatic social and economic distinctions between these two regions. And they're the areas that we're talking about. A lot of people up here, a lot of people down here, and yet the quality of life, the level of income, the welfare of the people varies significantly from one area to the other. So you have variable, not only economic, but this applies to a variety of other indicators, literacy rates, incidence of disease, things of that sort. All right, we're going to talk about these different regions here. I'm going to go from one to the other and look at each one, and this will have to be cursory, of course, because it's pretty hard to summarize everything that's going on in the short period of time that we have. But first of all, looking at Amazonia, the Amazon, the interior. It's a large area, but relatively sparsely populated. Now, the population is increasing, but still very few people out there for the total area. Here's the outline of the Amazon River Basin. So everything within this outline drains into the Amazon. And it's considered in many ways, I talked about this earlier in the course, biggest river in the world, biggest capture basin, biggest total volume of water flowing into the ocean. And some claim it's even the longest. If you follow the source of one or two of these tributaries all the way up into the Andes, it's competitive with the Nile and some of the big rivers of Siberia and some other ones as to which is the actual longest. But that's kind of an exercise in irrelevancy. This is what it looks like. Large body of water. There are places in the Amazon where you can't even see the opposite shore. And very deep as well, accommodates big ships. Now this is way up the Amazon. This is actually in Peru. So these ships, these large ships, have traveled all the way up the river to Peru. And various cities along the way. Here I am talking with somebody at Santarém, this place right here. We're talking about, he claimed he was a descendant of Americans. That's one of the things I was interested in, is settlement of Americans. Some of them went to Santarém and said, oh yeah, they're my ancestors, but I didn't believe a word he said. We're sitting there in a nice museum. And here is the city of Manaus, large city, capital of the state. This is mostly what it looks like, and this is actually being cleared. This is, for the most part, the natural vegetation is tropical rainforest, dense forest vegetation, a lot of species, a lot of varieties of plants and animals and insects, lush-looking vegetation, but the lushness and the diversity is actually an indication of the poverty of the resource base, in particular of the soils. You have a wide variety of trees and bushes, but one of the reasons is because you have limited number of nutrients within the soil to support any one particular species. Talk more about that. As you ride in a boat down the rivers, you see a good bit of habitation along the edge. You have these natural levees, and so the people will build their houses up on these little hills along the rivers, and these levees are made by the rivers themselves. But if you go behind this levee, it's extensive areas that can extend maybe 100 miles of swamps, low-lying areas that are periodically flooded. And so this is not indicative of the overall population. They live along the streams, but not further inland in many cases. Here's the city of Manaus, famous for its opera house right here in the middle with a gold dome, just like a Capitol building in Atlanta. And there was a time, and I'll talk about it in a minute, there was a time when this was economically very important. A lot of wealth being made here in this area, and opera companies would open, this is early 20th century, would open here at the Opera House in Manaus before anywhere else. There's an interesting tourist attraction now in the Amazon. It's a little town called Parintins. And what's happened over here the last several decades is they have focused on a traditional folklore story in Brazil about a about a relationship between a farmer and a sharecropper on an estate, and a relationship between the farmer and his wife and the prize bull of the landowner. And I won't bore you with all the intricacies of it, but essentially the wife of this peasant was pregnant, and she had craving for certain things to eat, and one thing she craved was the tongue of his prize bull. And so the farmer, to satisfy his wife, went and killed the bull and cut out the tongue. And so then there's a whole folklore, tradition, festivities, dancing associated with that. It all ends happily. The priest comes and blesses the farmer, and the owner of the bull forgives them, and the bull himself forgives the farmer, and so there's a relationship and dancing between the bull and the women, and it's really quite elaborate. And in this town of Parintins, they have a big open area, and they have competition of two groups. This goes on all week long, representing two bulls. One is capriccioso, the other is garantido. That means, well, one is guaranteed and the other is carefully done or something like that. One's blue and one's red. So there's a whole festivity. I'll show you a little bit of it. And it's become a big attraction. It's sort of like Carnival, except it happens in June rather than in January or February. So they make these elaborate floats, huge constructions. They come in, competition among the bands. And this goes on night after night, all week long, and at the end there'll be a judgment, and they'll decide who did the best job. And they put a lot of effort into this. They select the queen, and it's all built around this, trying to please the bull that got his poor tongue cut out. And these things are massive. They focus on themes from the forest, and you couldn't have dancing in Brazil without fairly naked ladies. Dress up as Indians, but most of their garb for the Indians are not necessarily typical of Brazil. They come from looking at old Western movies in the United States. Capriccioso means, I'm trying to think of the exact word, it means to be careful with something. Comes from the verb capricciare, to take care or be watchful. And so it's somebody who's careful. So anyway, I thought you'd be interested in that.
That's the forest area, though. They're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, they are. Okay, one of the main activities in the Amazon is shifting cultivation, and this is where people will go in, usually on land they don't actually own. Small-scale farmers, they'll clear the land and burn off an area, and in these areas that are cleared, then they'll plant some crops. They'll use the land for a period of time until the nutrient base in the soil is exhausted, and at that time they will move on somewhere else. So there's this constantly, it's land rotation agriculture, sometimes called milpa, and so they're clearing land and they're growing food crops for themselves, sometimes some commercial production, but mostly it's food. And so you see these areas out in the interior where they will do this, and then they'll abandon the land and allow the natural forest to revert, come back, and regenerate the nutrient base. The nutrients in the soil are located at a shallow level. You have high humidity, high temperature, and so these things become dissolved, wash away in the rivers, leach down to the depths out of the reach of the crops. And so this is one of the more effective ways they found of using the soil in some of these areas. But it doesn't support a dense population. You can't have a lot of people living out here if you're going to have to leave the land alone for a period of 20, maybe 30 years for the nutrient base to regenerate. Rubber has been produced in this area. I mentioned the Opera House in Manaus. A lot of the money coming into Manaus at that time was based on the rubber trade. Natural rubber from the forest in the Amazon was the only source of rubber in a world, early 20th century, when rubber was becoming highly demanded, making automobile tires and whatever. And so people would go out and they would tap the rubber from the sap of the tree, and there was not necessarily the people collecting the sap, but middlemen who were making fortunes off of this, until the British took some rubber to the Far East, planted plantations, and that was the end of the industry here in Brazil. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about Chico Mendes, who was assassinated. He was a leader of a consortium, or really a group of rubber tappers, and tried to organize them. Anyway, he got at odds with some of the owners and was killed. As I said, created a lot of wealth in Manaus. Not there anymore, but it was at one time. And there you see the Opera House. One interesting footnote to this rubber industry, some of the rubber was being produced in Bolivia. And it was in this northern area, and it was being shipped down the rivers to Manaus. These rivers, this is the Madeira River, goes on into Brazil. But there are waterfalls at some locations right in this area. So Bolivia contracted with Brazil to build a railroad around the waterfalls. And the railroad went from Guajará-Mirim up to Porto Velho, circumventing the waterfalls on the Beni-Madeira River within this area. It was a major enterprise. It was a major undertaking. Here you see an old map of it. That's when it was constructed, about 200 miles. Up to 30,000 people died as a result of this construction. Just accidents in the forest, snake bites, but especially disease, malaria, yellow fever. But it was built. They opened the railroad 1912, which coincided with the year when the British began to produce rubber in the Far East. So now you had a railroad constructed at great expense from nowhere to nowhere and nothing to transport. It stayed in operation until 1972, subsidized, when it was abandoned. You can still go out there and find evidence of, train tracks, trains, and but no activity, nothing on it. So all those people lost their lives essentially for nothing. There was just, in exchange, Bolivia gave a substantial amount of territory to Brazil for constructing the railroad. Brazil didn't give it back. So Bolivia was just out of luck. Here's an old roundhouse associated with the railroad. Another enterprise in the Amazon that received some attention, Henry Ford went down there and tried to grow trees, rubber trees, to supply his automobile industry. I put this book on here as an interesting description of all of that. A place called Fordlandia. Also essentially a failure for a variety of reasons. Don't have time to get into it now. Just didn't succeed, wasn't able to do what he wanted to do. Another enterprise, they wanted to produce, this fellow named Ludwig built a paper mill in Japan, towed it across the ocean, set it up in Brazil. He was going to grow trees in the Amazon and make paper. And all of that also financially went bust. So one of the features of the Amazon is they've tried these schemes, one after another, trying to produce something, trying to make the area economically viable or productive, without really much success. A couple of things that have persisted. There's some gold in the Amazon. Here's some views of the Serra Pelada, gold mining area that was very active up to about a decade ago. Fairly played out now, but just absolute destruction of the environment. They're still mining gold in the rivers. They use mercury to precipitate the gold, which is very toxic to the animal life and to the people in this area. This is illegal, but they nevertheless do it, destroying the environment. Bauxite is being mined. Here's a big mine at Trombetas. Bauxite is what's used to make aluminum, so there's some of that. And also iron ore. Here's a big iron ore mine at Carajás. But as you can see, there's very little regard for the environment in these operations. Prevailing view in Brazil is that, well, this is a vast area, nothing but forest, no good for anything. You know, why do we need to protect the environment? Let's just try to use it, and most of it then is destructive. There's a Carajás mine. They've tried to grow pepper with some success, jute, which is fiber, Brazil nuts. I showed you a picture of that earlier. Substantial indigenous populations out there, although many have died as a result of disease and contact with the whites. Some of them still living in primitive conditions. This fellow was instrumental in achieving some protection of the Indians. Colonel Cândido Rondon. There's an interesting book of his expedition into the Amazon with Teddy Roosevelt, looking for the source of the River of Doubt. And one of the things that comes out in the book is that Roosevelt got sick, and eventually it was an illness that killed him in the long run. But he was an explorer, and he liked adventure, and his son was along as well. Projeto Rondon, their sanctuaries have been established for the Indians. Unfortunately, they're not generally respected. So you can see large, what we would have called reservations. And so the outsiders are supposed to stay out and leave the indigenous population alone, but there's very little enforcement of some of these things. I'm going to show you, though, what many of the areas in the Amazon look like now by just looking at satellite images and backing off. So here we are, here's a settlement. They've come in and they cleared the land, and I'm going to back up. This is all focused on the same spot, just backing up. And you can see how much has been cleared, this area. So this whole area, large areas within the Amazon then have been devastated. They'll come in and they think, well, fertile land, we'll cut the trees down, we'll plant crops. They may be able to grow something for a few years, but this continued agriculture is detrimental, destructive of the Amazon. In the long run, a lot of these areas will end up as rough pasture for cattle and low-quality cattle production at that. One thing that's happened recently, and Charles, you probably talk more about this, they've discovered some black earths in areas of the Amazon. For various reasons, indigenous populations did some things that would provide increased nutrients in the soil. And so these areas are perhaps keys to understanding how maybe areas in the Amazon can be turned into productive areas. A colleague of mine, Bill Wood, University of Kansas, has been one of the main people to study this stuff. And here you see some of the locations. Okay, let me move on and talk about the Northeast here briefly, and then we'll take a quick break. Here are various states in the Northeast. Here you can see them. Northeast is poverty-stricken, difficult area, overpopulated. Some interesting, pretty cities. This is at Salvador, which is an attractive city. Beautiful beaches, cheap hotel accommodations. If you want to go on a nice vacation, go to Natal or Recife or one of these beaches in the Northeast. But again, a lot of poverty, a lot of social unrest, discord. The physical zones of the Northeast include what they call a zona da mata, which is an area of wet climate and favorable for agriculture. This strip right along the edge is where the Portuguese came in and began growing sugarcane. And sugarcane is still produced in this area. It's where most of the people live. As you get back into these interior regions, especially the Sertão area, this is very dry region, not really suitable for much of anything. So here's some pictures of sugarcane production still going on, although the more productive areas in Brazil were down in the southeast. And one thing in Brazil today is they're using sugarcane to manufacture alcohol, which is burned in the automobiles. So that's big production. Here's the port city of Natal. When we were there, they were just completing a major bridge across the entrance of the port. As I said, beautiful, beautiful beaches. We were just out riding around and went to see the, let's see, well, I'm trying to think, biggest tree in the world for cashew. That's what I wanted to say. Biggest cashew tree. A lot of. But as you move into the interior, you get into landscape that looks like this. A lot of exposed rock sticking up, not really productive soil. A lot of towns in the interior, it's severely overpopulated. They try to grow crops. And one thing that happens in this Northeast is you have intermittent and unpredictable rainfall. So it'll rain, adequate rainfall for a few years, and then you'll have 6 or 8 years of prolonged drought. And so that's almost, it is worse than an absolute desert because you don't know whether you're going to be able to do anything or not. Yeah, Charles?
Hey, Sonny, we bought some ranch tabletop here in Brazil. How big a industry that is down there?
It is. Well, first of all, let's see. Jim Saunders, who's teaching a class on Wednesday, told us that you think you're getting granite, but it's not really granite. It's something else, some other kind of pretty rock. But most of that production is coming from the southeast. It's from the area of Minas Gerais, yeah. And in here you can see typical construction out in the interior. They'll do a lot of what they call daub and wattle, packed mud on a bamboo frame. But a lot of it looks like this. Again, not really suitable for much of anything, but they will raise cattle. There'll be some scrawny animals they'll allow to roam about over this open area. And so there's folk types, cowboy type individuals. Intermittent streams, so you'll see a river bottom like this, and it looks fairly lush here. With a little bit of water, they'll cultivate, they'll try to grow crops, but when the drought sets in, then you can't get anything out of it. Doesn't work. There are a few large rivers that run all the way to the shore. This is the São Francisco, big hydroelectric project here. And there you can see an outline of it. This is an area of old settlement, and so it's an area that is deeply ingrained in the psyche and the tradition and the culture of Brazil. One of their more famous authors, and several others, have come from this area and talking about the poverty and the difficult life in that area. So a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, writers come from this area. And Brazil's most famous outlaw also came from this area. There's a picture of him, Lampião and his girlfriend, Maria Bonita, Pretty Mary. And they were, just like Bonnie and Clyde, they were caught and murdered, executed. That's the word. Well, you have a poverty area in the northeast, you have a wealthy area in the southeast, and so when they built roads connecting the two, that occasioned a substantial migration. A lot of people packed up, left the north, and came down to the south, or went to the south. Just the opposite over here. People left the south and went north. Well, there they went from north to south. They called them pau de arara. Pau is stick, arara is a bird, a parrot. And so what happened, they would travel on the backs of trucks, sitting on benches, and they said they looked like parrots sitting on a perch. And that's a pejorative term, and in Brazil I probably wouldn't even put this slide up, but since you don't know Portuguese, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's take a break, because I want to come back and talk about the rest of these areas to the south, and we don't have much time, so be quick, and we'll get back to work here in a minute. Okay, we're going to talk about an area known as the Center West. Not too many people live there. This is a little bit different from the Amazon region in that it's open landscape. It's grasslands with gallery forests. That means trees along rivers. And the most important feature here is Brasilia. I was talking to a few of you here just a few minutes ago, which is the capital of the country. Back in the late 50s, they decided they would move the capital from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia. Nobody was getting much work done in Rio because of the beaches and good time and carnival. So they moved it up there, and as I was saying, the government officials took them a long time to decide to move from Rio to Brasilia. They would travel over there, once or twice a month. And done by this guy, Juscelino Kubitschek. He decided one of his platforms is we need to go out and conquer the interior. We need to do something here with this. You look at a map of Brazil, we got all this empty space, we need to do something with it. So he built the city, large city, laid it out like an airplane. Here are government buildings down the main fuselage, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And these are residential blocks, big apartment blocks. And I've been there several times from the early days up to more recently. And today it is a well-developed city with all the functions of most major cities. But it was laid out as a planned city. So you'd have commercial areas that look just like each other. You go from, a mile or two down the road, and there would be the same little cluster of grocery store, pharmacy. It's hard to, just a uniformity that was unexpected. At one time, they decided they didn't like stoplights. Nobody likes to sit at a stoplight, and so they said, we'll build a city without stoplights. Well, as traffic picked up, they had all kinds of problems. They tried to make everything with avenues and on and off ramps, but they made on and off ramps with no merging space, so you just take your life in your hands and try to hit a gap in the traffic if you can. Anyway, there are a lot of things like that were unusual. There I am earlier, and here you see the main mall, I guess, looking down at the Senate and the House of Representatives, these administrative buildings. Beautiful chapel, cathedral, I guess. One thing that they did about Brasilia, they also decided that, having poor people in the city is not attractive. So we will forbid all low-income construction. And yet they still needed people to employ as construction workers, maids, janitors. And so around Brasilia, you have large communities looking just like this, where low-income people were housed. And what they would do would be, they were outside of the federal district. They would get on a bus or on a truck and every day would commute into town. So an interesting commuting pattern, but unlike over here where it's fairly wealthy people doing that commuting, down there it's all the poor people who are commuting. A lot of that's changed though more recently. This is what the landscape looks like. This is the Campo area. And you have the open Campo and the closed Campo and the various designations, but just natural grass, bush vegetation. Used for raising cattle. More of it looks like this now than, just range animals. So it's pretty high quality. Auburn University has a number of agreements with several universities in this area, in particular the one at the University of Goiás at Goiânia. A feature of this area that's interesting is an area known as the Pantanal. And it's a large area of, in some ways similar to the Llanos up in Venezuela, where you have, during the rainy season, it will be flooded and then dry up some in the dry season, but a real refuge for animals. And so there are all kinds of birds, and so they're trying to encourage development of this area now as a natural resource, a natural habitat for some of these animals, and promoting ecotourism into this region. Just a brief word about the south, extreme south. South in some ways is similar to Argentina, Uruguay. You have the gaucho type, a lot of cattle being raised down here in the south. Largest city is Porto Alegre. A lot of it looks like this, not so much sheep, a lot of sheep in Uruguay, but here it's mostly cattle. With the gaucho, Brazil we say gaucho, in Argentina it's gaucho. And again with rodeos and everything else. A lot of German immigrants down here as well. They've come over, most of the late 1800s, 19th century, with a lot of interesting features. I got a kick out of this. This was in publication, and so it was a picture. On one side it showed American soldiers training, and then they had a picture of a German woman from this particular town. I thought that was interesting. Okay, this is the most important, the most productive, the most developed, the most populated area in Brazil. If this area, São Paulo, Minas, Rio, if this were a separate country, it would have, it would be considered one of the more developed areas, similar to one of the bigger nations in Europe. And you can see a large concentration of people within this area. One of the largest cities in the world is São Paulo, and population anywhere from 22, 25 million, depending on how you define the overall urban area. Just a large cluster of people. With many problems. This is the main river, Tietê River, that runs through it, and they run a lot of the traffic across town along these marginal avenues. Well, there's no room to really expand, so they've got as many lanes as they can handle because of the river, because of the construction. Periodically, the river will flood, and if you're caught in a traffic jam here, you're just out of luck. Your car will get flooded, and it's happened at times where dozens of people have been killed because of flooding along that river. This is an older picture of São Paulo, largest building in the city at that time. Looked kind of like the Empire State Building.
Just comment about that river. We were down there about 5 years ago. It's a little problem. Not because it's so wide, but because pollution.
That's right. Very, very heavily polluted. And, you know, we don't have time to get into all the issues of pollution, but a lot of this is biological or human pollution, you know, just people using the bathroom. But in many ways, the pollution in the Tietê is not as bad as pollution in some other rivers around the world, but in particular rivers that go through some big, now this is a big industrial area, but other industrialized areas, because some of the worst pollutants are the chemical elements and the metal products and things like that go into the water. The biological pollutants, you know, down the river after a certain distance, these things kind of clear themselves out. So, but yeah, you're right. You don't want to go swimming in it, drink it.
In the hotels, tiles in the bathroom have a drinking glass with an X across it. I mean, this is an installed tile.
That's right.
Just to note.
Not the drink, right? You want to filter your water, some of those areas. Okay, so there's an earlier picture. Here's a more recent picture. You can see the traffic in the city picking up. They've taken a lot of these narrow streets and made them into pedestrian ways, which is great, but if you're trying to park a car, it's problematic. Rio de Janeiro is a big city, big, attractive, pretty city. This is Botafogo Bay, Sugarloaf in the background. And this is Copacabana Beach. I was telling some of you I was assaulted here a few years ago and slashed with a razor blade. Guanabara Bay, beautiful bay. Niterói, city across the way. I took my son down there one time, and Barbara about had a fit with him sitting on the ledge like that. When you go up Corcovado, you know, the statue of Christ, this is a jockey club, country club down below. But it's not only a tourist attraction with beautiful beaches, but it's also a major metropolitan area. Oh, by the way, I think I told you one time they were doing a movie up there, and so this was a set. I thought at one time that's Paul Newman, but it wasn't. It's somebody else. And we tried to get in the picture. I was just walking around one time, stopped for lunch at a little bar, a cantina, and had this guy's from Argentina. We got talking. He had a hamster there eating out of his plate. And actually it was on this side, so I made him put the animal on the other side. I didn't want his tail in my food. We had a good talk. But I said it with good language. I didn't. No, we had a friendly conversation. Mostly about soccer, because Argentina and Brazil, you know, back and forth in soccer a lot. But a lot of industry around the bay as well. Ship manufacturing, oil refineries, you name it, you find it in that area. And large numbers of people who live in the back bay area, many of them never get down to the beach. You know, they're going to work every day, and so it's a major metro area as well. And of course, upside of the mountains, a lot of these favelas, people like this.
Who did that artwork?
I thought that was interesting, wasn't it? All the eyes and face.
And who was the architect of Brasilia?
His name was Neymar. Yeah, Oscar Niemeyer. Other cities into the interior, I mentioned Piracicaba, there's a picture of it. Downtown area. This is from an earlier time, but you get some idea of how construction is done down there. A lot of the roofs are tile. These are not wood constructions. They're made out of mortar and brick. And so not nearly the problem with fires that you find over here, except in many of these apartment buildings, because you'll find furniture and features, elements within the apartment building that are flammable. And so sometimes you have some really bad disasters as a result of that. Here you get an idea of the construction. It's all framed cement. Now there's a lot of wood there, but that's just the scaffolding to then pour the concrete into reinforced areas, and that hardens up. Some street scenes. See more and more of the motorcycles and a lot of vehicles. This was at one time along the river in Piracicaba. There's a fellow who lived there. And for no reason other than it's just something he wanted to do, he would go to the dump and collect garbage and make these big lifelike dolls and just plant them here along the river and all up and down the river. I don't think they're there anymore, but he'd have one of them fishing and celebrating local events. At that time, there was a strike of the professors, of teachers in town. And so this is celebrating the teacher strike, Greve dos Professores. And it says, professors are not beggars. We need more than alms or a handout to live on. And one time, you'd be interested in knowing my brother who lives down there. He showed up here in the States, and we met him in Atlanta at the airport, and he had a big thing rolled up and thought he'd brought us a carpet or something. Well, it was one of these dolls. He'd gone down and got the guy to make him a doll just for his professor friend, professor brother back in Auburn. And so for years and years, we kept it on our back porch until the Yellow Jackets got in, and then we had to get rid of it. Picture kids, people, just ordinary street scenes from various areas. These look like tomatoes. They're not. This is a sweet fruit called a kaki, oranges. Bicycles, way to get around. A lot of people, that's all they can afford. She's sifting the rice or cleaning the rice. You have to, I'm sure it's not that way anymore, but at one time when I was growing up, you had to go through the rice and pick out all the rocks before you cooked it, because you don't want to be biting into the rocks. Buying some kind of little cookie thing. That's my sister when we were young. popcorn, just street scenes. They bring fresh meat to the market every day. Now, we're basically talking about interior Brazil. In the larger cities down São Paulo and all, it would be much like we purchase food over here, you know, frozen supermarket, that kind of thing. This is tobacco. And so he's making homemade tobacco, and then they'll cut off some of this and sell it, and then you use it to roll your own cigarettes. A lot of outdoor street markets, very common. And these things would be established in different neighborhoods, different days of the week. So you could go without having to go to town and buy your food. You could come here. And this is all tracing back to a time before people had refrigerators, had ways of storing their food, so you'd have to buy what you need every day from the market. I was walking around taking pictures. This guy on the left, he said, "Hey, take my picture, gringo," so on. And so they're cooking some kind of meat here that they were then selling. This guy on the right had a lot to say too. This guy was cooking, but he was kind of cooked himself. He's drinking rum there. More scenes from the interior areas. Now, these are older pictures. This is a brick manufacturing facility. Mules going around and mixing up the mud, and then they lay it out to dry in the sun, and so you have bricks. And here again you can see some of the construction, house construction, bamboo strips, and again the mud packtone, mango trees. There are a few areas where the original forest is still left. This is along the Atlantic coast, but not many. A lot of it's been cut down. They just came in and just wiped out these forests, big wood logs. Not there anymore. One feature of the southeast is you have a lot of this very hard but basalt rock. It's volcanic rock. It's very resistant to weathering and erosion. The dark red here indicates it. And as I mentioned before, where the rivers flow over this stuff, then you have dramatic waterfalls. A lot of exposed rock. That's my father on the right, and he loved to fish, big catfish. This is an area where I'm sorry?
Can you eat that fish?
Oh yeah, we did. Now this is further in the interior, and so the pollution, and this is also back at a time when it wasn't as much of a problem. So one of the places we would go fishing, now this is the Tietê River. Remember the river that starts in São Paulo, and it's flowing on down here. And I'm assuming that it's fairly cleaned out by the time it got here. And I'm pretty sure my mama didn't know that Daddy was taking his two little boys fishing in this area. Periodically, people would lose their lives falling in there. But we would run all over these rocks. Well, there's the Iguaçu Falls, famous, similar formations. This is Sete Quedas on the Paraná River. That's what it looks like today. Big Itaipu Dam between Brazil and Paraguay. So all the waterfalls have been covered over. Coffee grown throughout Brazil, famous for coffee. There's a lot could say about the economics of coffee and the pricing and everything, but here you can see large areas. This is actually in Paraná, one of the states down there. And notice how the bottom of the valley is left without planting. And as I understand it, and again, Charles, you could probably correct me on this, they do that because cold air settles, and these areas are more subject to frost, and coffee is very susceptible to frost damage. Can't tolerate freezing temperatures. But here you see, this is fairly recent. I should have put the date on here. But world's coffee production, 34% from Brazil, 7% from Colombia, other countries in Latin America, dominant producers. Other crops, a lot of things, soybeans. For a long time, my brother lived here. By the way, these are papayas. My brother lived with this family. He's an anthropologist, and so he was studying sugarcane cutters. And so he He actually moved in with this family and lived here for about a year. And he got a job as a sugarcane cutter, would get on the truck every day and go out and spend 12 hours cutting cane in the field. And they made fun of him because he wasn't near as good as they were at cutting cane. But he was studying, what their life was like. And they would go out, what you do is you burn the field. You dress with a lot of clothing because this stuff will cut you up. And sugarcane is big, more mechanized today, so a lot of the harvesting is done this way. You think this is progress, but at the same time it puts a lot of people out of work. So, it has social consequences. People will pack up and move to Sao Paulo and without much to do. A lot of it's being turned into alcohol for energy. And again, it's blended with gasoline for the automobiles, ethanol. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the different things that at one time they were using pure alcohol. That's doesn't function as well as blended fuels. So oil fields in Brazil. There's oil in the Amazon. There's oil up in the area around Bahia, Salvador. Some of the big oil fields that were down here in the southeast, and you may have read about in the last few years. Many of them very, very deep, and so they're still developing the technology to get to some of these petroleum deposits. When I was growing up, this was a major form of transportation while you got around. Dirt roads. They began producing trucks. Again, this would be back in the 60s. And kind of a Wild West flavor. Here's a big automobile manufacturer. I think this is Volkswagen. And so in Brazil, they're producing their own vehicles, their own trucks, and this is a consequence, of course, of what you get. Traffic jams all over the place. Again, when I was growing up, people would load up in trucks from the rural area and go into town. This was on Saturday night. They would go in and they would, go and just have a night off, and you would hang out in the main square downtown. Boys on one side, girls on the other side, and you'd walk around and kind of eyeball each other, see anybody who looks interested. But that was the thing. Today, bus travel is very, very common, and air travel. Big country getting around. They produce their own aircraft. A lot of these little commuter airplanes that we use here in the United States are actually manufactured in Brazil.
One thing that struck me, there were very few railroads, and I've always wondered why did Brazil, it seemed suitable for rail,
Yeah.
but they never developed it.
Well, during the rail period, of course, most of the people living along the coast, some to Sao Paulo, Rio, and so travel by ship was actually cheaper and more direct. They built some railroads, but there were a lot of issues with the railroads. They were corrupt, a lot of accidents, and in some ways, the railroad period, growing up, we traveled on trains, but it was sort of bypassed, and they went, straight to cars and trucks, and similarly, the home telephone period was sort of bypassed. They went to a period without anybody having a phone. Now everybody has a cell phone. So, you just... Speaking of railroads, there you go, Charles. So there are the railroads. But notice only one connecting the south to the northeast. Nothing going out into the interior. Ships, population. Here you see a distribution of the people. Population pyramid, this is by age bracket, so you can see a bulge here of young people. That's already moved up, because this is 2002. I have to get a new slide here. In Brazil, you have a great ethnic mixture. They were less reserved about intermarrying, black, white. Not as much indigenous influence, but a lot of immigrants. And so Italians, Irish, Spanish, all kind of mixed in together. So a little blonde fella, for instance, all Brazilians.
And there's a big Asian population.
There is. a lot of Asian. Culture, interesting, a lot of things we could say about culture. I put this saying, cada macaco no seu galho. That means everybody do your own thing. And that means each monkey on his own branch. Language, talk about Portuguese, religion, primarily Roman Catholic, although evangelical Protestants now a big component of the population. Aparecida is the patron saint of Brazil. It's kind of a gruesome story. They discovered a head, bodiless head, floating down the river, and immediately the people in the boat started catching fish, so they decided that she was brought a miracle. And anyway, long story, that's the patron saint of Brazil, the headless lady. If you've been to Brazil, you may be familiar with some of the African remnants or involvement in Macumba, Candomblé, a variety of influences. My father was there as a Protestant missionary. Here's the church that he was preaching in. And there's a real religion of Brazil. And famous soccer player, Pelé. And they've got a pretty good team this year. I have hopes for the World Cup coming up. These guys won it last time. Go home, yeah. The Germans. Music, love Brazilian music. If you've heard it, then you know the rhythm and the samba. And a lot of this, you know, you're probably familiar with the street carnival in Rio, or maybe even been a part of it. But what you miss is throughout the year, and especially at carnival time, you have a lot of just backyard samba schools, as they call them. People with drums and primitive instruments, and they just all night long will get into that rhythm, and it's really contagious. You may be familiar with capoeira, their version of free fighting, more of a dance though than one of the martial arts. Politics, okay. Let me just show you a little video here on the political situation in Brazil. Curitiba is a city down here in the south, and a lot of the prosecution of the corruption is taking place by a particular judge down here.
Tourism has always been a thriving industry in Curitiba, but in the last months, visitors have started to come here for all the wrong reasons. Vivian Flugar says newcomers are desperate to see the sites where the so-called car wash operation happened.
People come here from different parts of Brazil. They're curious about the investigation, they support the investigation, and we hope we can get rid of corruption in this country.
It began in 2014 as a money laundering investigation. It then expanded to include allegations of corruption at the state-controlled oil company Petrobras, where investigators say bribes were paid in return for contracts.
It is from this building that the judge leading the car wash operation, Sergio Moro, has ordered the forced interrogations, the detentions, and the sentences of some of Brazil's most powerful politicians and businessmen. For many, he's a national hero in the fight against corruption.
Moro's investigation has led to the imprisonment of the former House Speaker Eduardo Cunha for accepting around 40 million in bribes, and the former governor of Rio de Janeiro, Sergio Cabral, who could not justify his expensive lifestyle. It all started here, in the place many proudly call the Republic of Curitiba. The city has been at the forefront of the anti-corruption campaign. In a recorded conversation between Brazil's former president Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, da Silva had this to say.
I'm sincerely scared for the Republic of Curitiba.
Da Silva is now under investigation as part of the car wash operation. At the Niemeyer Museum, the works of art that belong to many of those detained are being shown. Juliana Bosnica says they have received more than 200 pieces.
It's important because it shows that federal justice is concerned about conserving all this work. There are several styles, most of them by Brazilian artists, and a piece from Miro.
So far, 89 people have been sentenced to prison, and over $3 billion has been recovered. Paulo Roberto Galvao is one of the prosecutors leading the investigation.
We managed to create a sort of domino effect, a cascade of happenings and new facts and new investigations coming up. We used some strategies for that, and one of those was the plea agreements that we managed to make.
A new phase has just begun, and it is expected to implicate even more politicians. Over 1,000 kilometers away from Curitiba, many in the capital, Brasilia, are already feeling the heat. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Curitiba, Brazil.
Okay, anyway, there's a whole lot we could say. You could read about it. Politics, different presidents. She was impeached. His current president's not very popular. Corruption investigation continues, and it's deep and widespread. Poverty is still a major problem, of course. Various rural movements. They have attempted to emphasize education. I'm not going to say much about this. But anyway, so the situation in Brazil is one where they have had their share of economic difficulties in recent years, and I think they are beginning to come out of that, and all of that has overlapped with this corruption investigation into the, they call it the car wash. That's named after a particular gas station in Brasilia where they were laundering money, not only laundering cars, but laundering money. And so that's where the name comes from. I have hope that things will improve, but certainly the country has taken both a political and an economic hit over the last few years. It's the National Tree of Brazil, it's EP. Okay, well, just sort of in summary of the course, I hope you've gained a little bit of idea of what's going on in Latin America. Put a portal here so you can kind of see, well, look into it. We've looked into it a little bit, and there's so much more to talk about. And then I did this. We've just barely scratched the surface. I kick out of that.
You left out one of the big Brazilian industries, and that's plastic surgery and beauty queens.
Oh, okay. They're top of the line, aren't they? And I'll vouch for that. Okay, other things, there are all kinds of things we could talk about. One of them that came to mind, if we had more time, we could talk about military dictatorships. There's a new style dictator that's kind of a populist. So from Castro, Chavez, these are not the typical dictators from the past, but they're more based on sort of populist movements. Trends toward democracy, is it going on? I'll let you look at this. I'll put the slides up. Other things we could talk about, all kinds of changes taking place in the economies, many of them still export-based, commodities production, what's happening in agriculture, urbanization. So there are dozens of things to still be talking about. Hopefully you've seen from the pictures that it's a beautiful part of the world with a lot of pretty physical features, things worth seeing. But I would say the most attractive aspects are the people themselves. So if you go down there, then try to get out and visit with some folks and not just look at the sites, but interact with some of the people. Okay, thanks for being a part of it.